Hello, everyone. My name is Gilberto Lopes. I'm a medical oncologist at the University of Miami in Florida in the United States. And it is a pleasure for me to be here with you today at the clinical trial workshop for young oncologists in Moscow, Russia. I hope that next time we'll be able to actually meet in person as I did the year before the World Cup when we had another one of these ASCO supported symposium. And I'm hoping that in the next year or so, we're going to be able to go back to a more normal life, COVID willing. So today we're going to be talking about writing, submitting, and publishing our research. If you don't publish what you're doing, that means it never existed. That's unfortunately just the way it is. In academic medicine in particular, we do have this push that if we're not being productive, if we're not actually generating knowledge and getting that knowledge out in the world, we're not really working at all. And today I'm going to be talking about not just what ASCO does in publishing. Actually, that's going to be a very small part of what I'm going to be showing you. I'm actually going to be discussing what it is that makes a good writing for a scientific article, especially an original article. And I'm going to explain a little bit what the peer review process is, what happens when your manuscript actually gets to one of our journals or the journals in general, and what we can do to increase your chances of getting that manuscript published. And the most important thing is that for you, that's a very important manuscript. So you need to convince and show the people reading it and making decisions about it that this is worthy of publication in the journals you're sending to. So there's a lot of tricks, a lot of tips that I'm going to be showing you in the next few slides. So ASCO today has 5 journals. I'm showing you here the original journal, Journal of Clinical Oncology, which is read by most practitioners in oncology around the world. We now have the Journal of Oncology Practice and the Journal of Global Oncology. All these journals today are called JCO something. So JOP became JCO-OP, JGO became JCO-GO, and we also now have Precision Oncology as well as Clinical Informatics journals. I'm not going to show those that much because those may not be of interest for you today. This is the Journal of Global Oncology, which is now called JCO Global Oncology. That's the journal for which I'm the editor-in-chief for ASCO. And I'll be happy to take a look at any manuscripts that you have that you'd like to think and decide if it makes sense to send it to JCO-GO or not. So let's get into the meet and greet of the talk today, which is the peer review process, so that we can understand what happens when your manuscript get to us. You usually use an editorial process, an editorial system that is an IT-based platform that you usually use online. And this is mostly cloud-based today, although some manuscripts still have their own servers, which is becoming less and less common. So usually what happens is you go into that system, you log in your manuscript, and a lot of journals still have the policy that you have to have it in the complete format that they want for publication. So we have changed that in our ASCO journals. Usually you can just send it in a relatively rough form as long as you can read it and as long as it's in a standard format that you can understand what's being there and what the references are. But we usually don't ask you to have everything with a specific format as other journals used to. But many journals still do that. But the more important part is not just that. Unfortunately, that's what most of us take a lot of time and spend a lot of time getting everything in the right format. But the most important thing is that your original article should be telling something. It should have something new to present to the audiences of that journal. And that's what the peer review process is going to be doing. It's going to be looking at your article, at your study. It's going to see and try to poke holes in it, which means they're going to try to see if it makes sense, if it sounds truthful, and if what's being shown in terms of what the experiment was or what the study was is really true of what the results, the discussion, and the conclusions are as well. So peer review enables journals to objectively assess the merits of your manuscript and if it's suitable for the specific journal, the specific publication that you have sent it to. It should also provide constructive feedback for you so that you can improve the manuscript, even if it doesn't get published in the specific journal. Unfortunately, we got so busy these days that more often than not, we end up rejecting manuscripts, in the journal, that we don't even have time to provide constructive feedback. So if we see that the priority of that paper would be so low that it's extremely unlikely that we will publish in the journal. Today, unfortunately, we reject a number of papers without review, which misses that part of the constructive feedback. So that's why it's so important that you match your article to the correct journal, and I'll get there in about a minute or so. And peer review also enhances original scientific research and adds greater value to the literature, because we are doing a process where we actually are judging and taking a look at a manuscript to make sure that what's being published makes sense and hopefully will move the science or that specific practice forward as well. So who are these famous peer reviewers? They are independent experts who serve as editorial board members, or they're external reviewers. So each journal is going to have a core group of editorial board members, and they will have a number of people that we have reached out to. Usually they have published in the journal before, and that's how people more often than not get selected as external reviewers. So if you publish at the JCOGO, it's very likely that when we get something in your area of expertise, we will be sending you something for review as well after you have published with us. So editors ourselves will provide expert opinions quite often, and we should send you a detailed critique of the manuscript as a peer reviewer, both as editor and as a regular peer reviewer. We sometimes call these peer reviewers referees, just because they're judging if we should or should not publish this specific article. And most journals do withhold the identities of reviewers, and usually do this in a double blind fashion, so that the reviewer doesn't know the identity of the authors as well. And these reviews are considered blinded, and they tend to give kind of a more fair hearing for the article itself. So most important step when you're actually trying to choose where to send is to match your research to the correct journal. How do we do that? There's a number of different journals in medical oncology, in clinical oncology, radiation oncology, surgical oncology, and other cancer-related topics. I mentioned the ASCO journals, but we have a lot of options today. We have specific oncology journals, such as the Lancet Oncology. But of course, as you know, for large phase 3 trials, the set new standards, more often than not, those are going to be published in the New England Journal of Medicine or at the Lancet in Europe. And these are all very adequate journals for most research, but you have to be very specific. You have to look at the journal and see which journals are the ones that are actually publishing that specific area, or that have an interest in those things that we are doing and that we have focused our manuscript on. So is it a general journal? Is it subspecialty? Is it basic or clinical research? What does it usually publish? So take a look at the journal, see what articles they have published recently, and that will be very helpful. One important thing is the impact factor calculation. This is how we calculate it. We take all of the items, all of the articles that were published in a specific year, and see how many citations they got, and then we divide that by the number of articles that were published. So in this example here, in these 2 years, there were 22,000 citations for 1,224 items. So the impact factor divides those two, so it's an impact factor of 18. And this changes every year, so you have to go and take a look at new lists. I usually on purpose keep an old list just to show how it has changed. A lot of these journals, Lancet Oncology, JCO now, have impact factors that are much higher than what I show here. So with the internet, with the ease of actually accessing, we have seen a lot more citations today than we used to see 10 years ago. This brings us to how we write an effective original report. So for those of us who grew up in languages that you usually have to write a lot more than in English to express something. So for instance, I usually read Russian literature in Portuguese because that has a structure that's much closer to Russian than what English is. So English is extremely effective in the sense that it's efficient. You can write a lot fewer words in English than you would in most languages, including Portuguese, French, or Russian. So always think about that. In English, if you can cut something and you keep the same meaning, you should always do that, which is completely different from Portuguese, where the more you write, the more you show how erudite and how much you actually learn your language in school. And I understand that Russian sometimes can be like that as well. So when writing for scientific reports, we want to use this we call effective writing, because it allows for easier evaluation of the scientific merit of the study, because it's kind of a standard way of reporting it. It makes the review process shorter, because people know what they're expecting to find at which section of the manuscript and with which language. That makes it easier to make the reader see how the manuscript flows. It also decreases the amount of copy editing needed. So copy editing is after we get something approved, we're going to have specialized people called copy editors that will go over, make sure everything that's spelled is spelled correctly, make sure that everything is in grammatical correct sentences as well. And if you do use effective writing, that step is a lot shorter, and we get to your publication a lot faster, and it gets out there and gets published a lot faster. So effective writing is about the ABCs. It should be accurate, it should be short, or brevity is the quality, and it should be clear, so clarity. So accuracy, brevity, and clarity is what we're striving for. So the editors are going to be looking, is what I'm reading new? Is it true? And most importantly, is it going to affect the practice of oncology, or is it going to have an impact for our readership? And those are the questions that we're looking into. And it's a lot easier if you go for clarity and simplicity. So if you're right, we have several recommendations for improvement. That's a lot better than we have developed a number of recommendations that may lead to improvement. So you see how much longer that is, and how much shorter, how much clearer, and how much simpler the first sentence actually is. So we should use first person. When I was trained, we used to use, and this was true in English as well 30 years ago, we use a lot of passive voice because science was supposed to be not personal. Today, what's accepted as a standard is that we should use first person. So you did the study. So in the example here, we detected TP53 alterations in 30 patients, and not TP53 alterations were analyzed and found to be present in 30 patients. So that's the way we used to do 30, 40 years ago. Now we want to go straight, and we do want to use first voice. The statements we make should be positive and definitive. Yes, efficacy was similar across the 5 arms. Direct, simple. And we should not do no, as in the sentence here. Efficacy was not much different across the 5 arms. So that makes it a little bit more iffy. It's not really as positive and definitive as the first example. And as I mentioned, we should always delete any unnecessary words. That's the way English makes it easier, shorter, and more efficient. As the example of what we should do, another approach uses disease-specific survival. Very direct. And what we shouldn't do is another possible approach is to use disease-specific survival. So we really don't make much of a difference with that possible in the sentence, so we can just cut that word. And we should always avoid repetition. You don't need to write something you wrote in results back in the discussion before actually doing the discussion of what those results actually mean. So you should state the main idea in a topic sentence. The overall safety profile was acceptable in this population. TP53 alterations strongly correlate with morphologic non-response to relapse therapy. We should also always use generic names for drugs or instruments. If we do use or must use a commercial name, you include the name and the location of the drug manufacturer, the first mentioned in the text. So for instance, Avastin, trademark from Genentech in South San Francisco, California. And beyond that, you would use bevacizumab, which is the generic name, instead of using Avastin, which is the brand name. When we do give units of measurement, we should give those in the International System of Units, and we should spell out acronyms and abbreviations when we first use them. Even if it's something that is extremely common and that everybody sees almost every day, we should still spell that out once, and the first time actually that you do put that in the text. So colorectal cancer, you will put in between parentheses, you put CRC, develops as a result of a series of accumulated genomic changes, so on and so forth. And then in the second sentence, you can go, these characteristics may classify CRC into subsets of distinct clinical behaviors. Another example, the variability of computed tomography, CT-based tumor measurement. So the next time you could use CT and not have to write computed tomography again. Trial designs are extremely important, and any effective article will always be the product of an effective study design. And you should really make friends with biostatisticians all the time and very early. The earlier a biostatistician gets involved, the easier will it be for you to write the statistics section and to actually report the results in a correct, efficient manner. How to report the research? Now we're getting to the actual writing of the article. We should state the problem or pose your questions clearly. That's what the introduction does. You should show your results, the evidence, and demonstrate that it's valid, that the methods that you used made sense. You should discuss the initial implications and provide additional evidence from other authors. You should assess the conflicting evidence or trial limitations. You should state the implications of your work very clearly, and you should mention what you're doing next if you are moving forward in that same field. And for phase 2 trials, we should always mention if there's a phase 3 trial that is planned or underway. Before you actually sit down to write, 2 important things. We should avoid writing multiple articles using the same data set unless there's new information, longer follow-up, or something that is substantial. And we call that salami science, when you use the same data set for several publications that are all the same. And we should not do that. Should also avoid claims of novelty or originality unless what you're showing really is new. And it's a lot easier for us today with PubMed, and we do use it. And of course, Google search also, Google search and Google Scholar make it very easy. We also have software that will go over every single word in manuscript and will tell us if that specific sequence of words has been published before or not. So if you do cut and paste from another article, today we will see it. It's that easy to find. These are the elements and sections of an original report. We usually have an abstract, but not all not all journals will have abstracts, but most do. We will have an introduction, materials and methods, results and discussion, and some places we might have a specific conclusion section as well. This can change a little bit, but this is the usual elements. These are the usual elements that we do see in most manuscripts in most journals. I don't usually write the article in sequence from introduction down to the conclusion. I usually use this sequence, but of course, depending on how you work and depending on what the article is, you might do things a little bit different. So I usually start with the materials, methods, and results because that's what you had from the protocol. And then I go back and write the introduction, but those are kind of interchangeable. You could go for the introduction first. And then after that, I do the discussion. And the last thing I do is actually the abstract, because that's the one most important thing besides the title that everybody is going to read. So title has to be accurate and concise. It has to describe what you're showing, and you should mention the key findings or the key questions. You should have specific or informative keywords. You should aim to try to catch the reader interest. What most readers will read if they're looking at a list of articles is just the title. So the title has to be your hook that will get people into actually checking the abstract and then reading the whole article. Then you should make it objective in tone. You do not need to include objectives, a schema, number of participants, and results. Actually, that's usually frowned upon. So let's take a look at a good title. Let's start with the one in the bottom: Induction Chemotherapy and Conformal Radiation Therapy for Young Children with Non-Metastatic Medulloblastoma. Children's Oncology Group Study P9934. So it explains who did the study, what the study is, what the population is, and it's very concise. Compare that to the one in the top. A prospective trial on 64 patients between the ages of 8 months and 3 years of systemic platinum-based chemotherapy, second surgery, and conformal radiation therapy, CRT, dose 50.4 centigrade, limited to the posterior fossa, and blah, 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 blah. That is too much. We don't want that. We might think that that might actually attract more people, but people stop reading it after the first, second, and third sentence. So you need to be concise and try to show what it is that you're presenting with that article so that people do get an interest and do come to read it. The abstract, as I mentioned, is the second most important thing after the title. It summarizes your article. It can be easily found on the internet. And even if you have a paywall and you cannot read the whole article, most journals and most databases will allow you to read at least the abstract. Not all journals will require abstracts. Commentaries, editorials often will not have abstracts, but for original articles, most journals will have abstracts. And you should always check the specific information for contributors of each journal as you get ready to prepare these. A structured abstract is what most use, and this highlights the most important elements: why we're doing the study, purpose, objective, what methods and materials we used, what the results were, and what are the conclusions following those results that we show. In certain articles, especially when not describing original research, as I mentioned, an abstract without headings would be a little bit more appropriate. So mention what your research question is, why we did this study, and what the methods and conclusions are. You only put the most important data, so usually primary endpoint and the most important secondary or exploratory endpoints. You avoid understating toxicities, and you do not overstate results. So usually when a pharmaceutical company in particular or sponsor pays a ghostwriter to write an abstract, we see that all of these get inflated, and we have a lot more overstatement of results than we have with academic authors. So it's very clear to us that who wrote the article was not an academic author, was more of a ghostwriter. So we should definitely check that everything in the abstract is exactly the same in terms of results and numbers as you see in the main article. And sometimes we have seen that. So this is an article, for instance, that showed the discordance between conclusions stated in the abstract and conclusions in the article. This is an analysis of randomized controlled trials published at JCO, and these were articles on systemic therapy. And from 114 randomized clinical trials, 90 for non-small cell and 24 for small cell, 10% had discordant conclusions in the abstract versus the body of the article itself. So this is extremely upsetting for anybody who's reading, and we should absolutely avoid, because that does show that you're being lazy when doing that. And as you can see, the peer review process is not perfect because that got through, and in this review article they were able to show that. So be careful, make sure that things are consistent. Peer reviewers are not magical, copy editors are not magical, and all the systems we have will have mistakes. So you, in the end, are responsible for the article, and you're responsible for the manuscript that you're getting out there. So introduction, we define the problem and the structure of the article. You give an overview of the literature, you identify the gaps of knowledge, you state what you're looking for, your research question, and the reason why you did this trial or this study in general. You explain how your study will answer that question. You usually should have just a few paragraphs. Anything more than 5 paragraphs is usually too much. Anything less than 3 paragraphs is usually too little. So between 3 and 5 is kind of a good rule of thumb. Sometimes if it's a little bit more complex, you can go a little bit longer than that, but usually that's not needed. So somebody who was not familiar with that area of research in that field should be able to understand what the study is about after reading the introduction. And you should use an objective tone and criticizing previous work. And was there anything there that didn't need to be there? If it was, just cut it out. In materials and methods, you explain how you collected your data. You explain why you selected that specific study. You define very clearly what the inclusion-exclusion criteria for the study participants was. You describe the interventions, and you state the specified measurements and methods. Today, many journals will actually ask you to send a copy of the protocol itself, and often that will be in the server so that people can access it as well. So for large phase 3 trials, especially for those that set new standards, we are seeing the journals are keeping copies of the protocol so that people can check those in detail as well. We should note statistical procedures for assessing data when we're looking at materials and methods. We should provide enough details so that people can confirm the results and that they can critique and replicate the procedures if they're going to try, especially if this is preclinical work. A lot of literature suggests that many of our preclinical studies are actually not replicable and might be wrong. We should adhere to all checklists in that specific type of study we're doing. So if clinical trials, we should use consort, and we should also state whether the study received any institutional review board approval. We cannot accept anything that has people as subjects without IRB approval and informed consent. So that has to be clearly stated in any trials. In results, we should describe what you discovered, summarize those primary results without interpretation in the results section, and we can order findings from the primary endpoint to secondary endpoints, experimental or hypothesis generating, depending on what you're doing. You should highlight any findings of unequivocal statistical significance, and we should state whether the study produced the expected results. Are the effect sizes for the main outcomes easily found? And we should include any significant negative results as well. Everything that we report should be objective. So anything that was statistically insignificant, we should just say that. We should avoid creating new metrics, like, for instance, something that makes no sense, in between quotes, a significant trend was seen. There's no such a thing as a significant trend. If it's a trend, it's not significant. So do not say things like that. And we should always assess conflicting evidence or trial limitations. For the results, always try to use visual ways, figures and tables, to present the data without having to repeat the same data in the text. So you don't need to say every single side effect, but you should, for instance, show toxicities were similar between treatments, except for neuropathy, and then that you can describe in detail, but all other toxic effects, all other adverse events, you can actually just have in the table. You don't need to repeat and rewrite all that in the results section. When we get to the discussion, you have to discuss the implications of the findings, describe how those results will advance the field. You will tell us what is novel, but of course you have to make sure that you're right. And you're going to demonstrate how the data answer the research question. And you will only speculate if you have support in the data you generated to do that speculation, or if the literature allows you to do that. And of course, you should include references as needed. You should avoid repeating what you wrote in the introduction and results. You do not need to write anything twice. And you should state the implications of your work clearly, but you should avoid exaggerating. So if your study did not set up a new standard, you should not try to squeeze it in such a way that will make it be a new standard. And you should explain any weaknesses in your methods. Usually we're very favorable when authors tell us what is wrong about their study, and that usually gets the chances of an article being accepted to be higher, actually. We should emphasize the importance of your work on the basis of the results, and we should be cautious in making broader firm recommendations for clinical practice unless the implications are clear. References have to be included. We have to ensure that you have interpreted the references correctly to support your arguments, and you should reference all works that are essential to your study. So any previous work, any preclinical studies, or anything that looks different than the results that you got should be included. And when possible, you should reference the primary source, or the actual study that showed that those results, instead of a secondary source, such as a review article, and it should verify all internet URLs. Extremely important to, after you finish writing, read it, reread it, and read it a third time, because every time you read, you'll find things that you didn't see the time you did before. Always have all authors take a look at the whole manuscript, have people who did not participate in the study take a look as well. All that helps you improve in writing the article and makes it easier to understand. It makes it easier to make it a better manuscript as well. So make sure there's no errors in data, that spelling makes sense, and that acronyms are all defined in first use. And try not to use jargon that isn't appropriate. So the terminology should be appropriate for the audience that's reading that paper. We also can use professional editing. This is when you hire somebody to help you make that manuscript better. It's usually useful, especially when you don't speak the language for which you're publishing in. So if you're not that used to speaking English or to writing in English, it does make sense sometimes to hire a professional to help you do that. And there's a number of reasons as listed here why we usually do that. Before I finish, important thing in terms of authorship. So what are the criteria, what's the recognition, and what are the responsibilities of an author? So the benefits are clear. Being an author in a scientific manuscript brings recognition for your achievement in academic medicine. It documents the research data, and it facilitates academic promotion and career development. So in most institutions in the United States and Western Europe, you usually need to have a certain number of publications of a certain impact before you can be promoted from being a clinical instructor to assistant professor to associate professor to professor. So authorship is how you show that you're not just working, but that your work is being read and is making a change in your field of interest. Many people shape that research. We have primary investigators, we have their mentors, we have the staff at clinical sites, and we have pharmaceutical representatives as well, and pharmaceutical teams that have helped develop the trial. Each person contributes, and which sometimes that makes selecting the appropriate authors difficult. So if you look at an article of a large phase 3 trial, you're going to see that there's some several to sometimes a few dozen articles, but in reality, hundreds, if not thousands of patients, of people helped participate in that trial, not counting the patients. So we need to see who has contributed significantly to become an author. And authorship should be an honor, not an honorific. And what I mean by that is that just because I'm the chair of my department, I should not be included in an article if I did not participate and I did not fulfill the criteria. And these are the criteria that we usually use. Most journals today adhere to these guidelines established by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, or ICMJE, and you can find that online on this website. And these are the criteria. And some journals will have a little bit more than this, but at a minimum you have these, and you have to meet all three of the following criteria. You have to contribute to the study in one of three ways. Either you designed and you created the idea for the study, or you acquired data, or you analyzed and interpreted the data. So if you only analyzed and interpreted the data, that's still enough for you to be an author. If you didn't do any of these three, then you should not be an author. You should also draft or revise the article for important intellectual content. You don't need to review and change or look at every single word, but you have to be able to vouch and say that this article represents what I think it should represent. And you should approve the final version, and that's how you do that. So you have to contribute, you have to revise, review the article, and you have to approve and take responsibility for the final version. So in conclusion, as we're coming to 20-25 minutes of this talk, you should choose a journal that is a good match for what you did, for your work. You should use effective writing. So for English, the less, the better. So try to write in concise, short sentences, make it simple for your reader. The tips we discussed hopefully will improve your chances of favorable reviews and acceptance. Make sure we follow those authorship rules. And this was the conclusion that I had back in 2017 before the World Cup. So I wanted to leave it here to remind me of having been in Moscow in person at least once before, and hopefully we'll be back as soon as the COVID situation is a little bit better. So thank you very much. These are my contact emails, my Twitter handle, and my cell phone for WhatsApp. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I am looking forward to being able to meet you either in Russia or in international meetings as we move forward. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful event in this clinical trials workshop. Have a good day.